Doctors are very important figures in our lives that sometimes even have our lives in their hands. However, being only human, a few in their ranks may act irresponsibly or recklessly, and some may be simply incompetent. That's when licensing boards often get involved. Welcome to Insights. I'm Dick Goldberg. Today we'll examine what types of behaviors result in license suspensions, revocations, and various disciplinary actions. We'll see if there are common patterns in these physicians' behavior and learn how you can reduce your chances of receiving such treatment. And with us is Jack Zweig. Jack, an attorney, recently retired as prosecutor of several licensing boards for the state of Wisconsin, including those for psychotherapists, nurses, and physicians. Presently, he's a consultant to attorneys in cases like these. He speaks in Wisconsin and throughout the nation on this subject. Thanks for joining us, Jack. Jack, how common is this? How often are physicians in a position where a licensing board is looking at what they're doing?
Well, Dick, I think in order to appreciate the frequency or actual infrequency of this, one needs to know that there are about 22,000 licensed physicians in Wisconsin.
Okay.
Or they're licensed in Wisconsin. How many are actually practicing in this state, I'm not certain.
Okay.
But the Medical Examining Board, who licenses and disciplines doctors, recently put out their annual report for 2013, and it indicated that last year they had received 542 complaints against physicians.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Now, the receipt of a complaint certainly doesn't mean that a doctor's done anything wrong. It means that someone thinks they have. And the source of the complaint sometimes is a good indication of what the probability is that there's something to really be looked at. About 55% of the complaints received by the board last year came from either patients or the patients' families.
Mm-hmm.
The other 45%, about 8% came from other agencies, government agencies, either federal or state, and about 8% came from the National Practitioners Data Bank, where any time there is a malpractice payment made on a physician's part anywhere in the country, any state has taken discipline against a physician, it's reported to the National Practitioners Data Bank and then sent to wherever they're licensed.
Okay.
So that makes up another 8%. About 5% are self-reports, and 3% are anonymous, and various other sources.
You know what is striking me is I don't hear other doctors reporting.
Actually, there are other licensees, and I don't know whether they could be doctors, they could be nurses. It's only 3%.
That's small.
It is small. And what's a little striking about that is that a couple of years ago there was a new law here in Wisconsin that compels a physician to report another physician if they believe they are practicing incompetently or if they are engaging in conduct which is a danger to patients or the public. The annual report doesn't indicate how many of these complaints came in specifically under that statute.
By the way, what we're talking about, since our audience is anywhere and everywhere, I assume would pretty much apply to other states. That it probably isn't that different, or is that a false assumption?
The overall scheme of there being some licensing entity that does the licensing of doctors and the disciplining of them is consistent. It's a state-by-state basis. What they consider to be conduct for which discipline should be imposed may differ, and not every state has a law such as the one I just mentioned about self-reporting, or about reporting other doctors.
Okay. How many of these 500 and so many complaints, 542, lead to action of some kind?
Well, good question. First of all, what's done is the complaints are screened by a panel of 2 physician members of the board, a public member of the board, and one of the prosecuting attorneys in the agency. They take a look to see, is there any violation here? Although the complaint comes in and it may not have a lot of information, there's a screening personnel who ask for more information either from the complainant or from the doctor, or from both. And with that information, they take a look at it and say, all right, is there a possible violation here? And if there is it anything that we would want to expend our resources on? So out of the 542 that came in, about 50% are even open to investigate beyond that screening function.
Okay, and then of that 50%, how many are found in some way acting improperly?
Last year, 74.
So out of 22,000 physicians, 74 got some kind of censure, suspension, discipline. That's a very small number, isn't it?
It is a small number, and depending on what your perspective is on what the reason is, it's either a good thing or a bad thing. If it's because Wisconsin physicians are overall pretty darn good, and I think that's true, then that's a good thing. If, however, it's because either complaints aren't coming to the board or the board isn't doing anything about complaints that should have some action, then it's a bad thing.
Okay, I know people who've worked in ORs, and I said if I ever need a surgeon, I'll bet the best person to ask is not another surgeon, but a nurse who works in the OR or a technician. And they said, right. And I asked them, what percentage of doctors are scary in the operating room? They said, most do just fine. A few are great, and a few are really scary. And I asked them what makes them scary. Actually, this was for surgeons and particularly anesthesiologists. They said with an anesthesiologist, I'm just saying this, I don't know if it's a fact, but this is what I heard. Just throw it out to you. Most of the time, they do fine because there's nothing unusual that happens. When something bad happens, they have to respond very quickly. And a few of them are terrific at that. Some of them are very good at that emergency when it happens, and a few of them not good under crisis. I wondered, you're not in the OR, but from where you've been sitting for 30 years, do you have any reflections on what I just said?
Well, I guess the first thing I would say is it shouldn't be surprising that people are going to react with different skill levels and different judgment levels. They do that in every profession. There is lawyers, just about anything. Mm-hmm. The licensing of physicians is done to what sounds like a very low level, but is actually an adequate level. What they're trying to determine is whether a physician is minimally competent to practice the profession. That's the standard, minimally competent. Now, would you want to send your mom to a minimally competent surgeon? I think not. But that's what all that licensing does. And licensing is to discipline those people who fall below that level.
Okay. Is there, in your opinion, again, I know you can't give me a fact here, but is there a protection among doctors for other doctors? I mean, that's a very tiny number of doctors reporting.
I don't think that when you say protection, it sounds like
code of silence.
Like a conspiracy.
A code of silence.
A code of silence, which they used to call it. I don't think so. I think there is a hesitancy to report other doctors for the same reason that people hesitate to report anything. They don't want to get involved. They're afraid of the consequences of doing so. They're afraid they'll be sued by someone.
Sure.
Although there is also another statute that gives protection from that. I don't think people think about it. But so long as any report is being made in good faith, they are immune from any civil liability.
And how about if they witness a very bad practice and they don't report it? It sounds like the law requires them to report it.
It does now. Yes, it has for the past, about 4 years, I think it is.
Has it caused any uptick in doctors reporting on other doctors?
I don't know that.
You would think it's more nurses reporting on doctors than doctors reporting on doctors.
There have always been nurses who would report on doctors, and that was a very good thing. Many of them wanted to do it anonymously, and about 3% of the complaints that come in each year are from anonymous sources. The problem with an anonymous complaint is it's so difficult for the investigators to do any follow-up on.
Yes.
They have nothing that they can dig into at a starting point. We would sometimes get calls from people who would not identify themselves, who would describe a situation that we would very much want to do something about if it was true. And yet they were afraid for their jobs. Isn't always
These are
being
people in the
sued.
medical profession?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Sure.
And one thing we could recommend is send in the complaint with as much information as possible. List a number of people who have information about it, and include yourself in the list.
I see. So it's
and,
not
and
necessarily
basically you can camouflage yourself a little bit, and yet we could then do the find the information we needed to complete the investigation.
Can you tell us a little about the calls you might have gotten that are anonymous reporting? What are they reporting?
Oh, well, we didn't get a lot of them, but of those we got, a fairly typical one was a concern by office staff or a nurse working with a physician, concerns about impairment from alcohol or substances, that the doctor had come in to the office and was practicing, and they could smell alcohol on him or her.
Mm-hmm.
The doctor was staggering, and that they were truly concerned that he was impaired while he was practicing. We would get a few of those. And even then, the people didn't want to make a complaint or file it under their name because they're employed by him.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously they had two concerns. One, if he found out, he would retaliate against them. Two, if the board were to take away his license, they would lose their job. So I mean, they're very conflicted about it, and yet they wanted to make sure that no one was harmed.
Wow. I know this is another question you might not want to answer, but if you had to bet, do you think these kind of things are largely or a great number are underreported or unreported?
Oh, I think that many things are unreported that should be reported. People used to call me and say, is this something I can or I have to report? And my response would be, in some cases, there's nothing to compel you to do so, but you're asking the wrong question. The wrong question is, should you be reporting it?
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything that prohibits you from reporting it? Not are you mandated to report.
So,
but that is the mindset of most people.
Okay, so I'm hearing alcohol and drugs is one.
Yes.
And doctors, of course, have free access to drugs, let alone alcohol like we all do.
Correct.
Big problem?
Yeah, I'd say a big problem. It's a big problem for all healthcare providers. The Board of Nursing, the majority of their complaints are for drug diversion, drug use by nurses. With physicians, there's also a significant number. The board has the ability to summarily suspend someone's license. Now, in most cases, the board must go through an entire hearing process, prove what the person has done, prove that it's a violation of the rules, mm-hmm. and prove that the person should lose the license for it. And so it's a constitutional rights issue.
Sure.
However, if there is conduct which is so serious that it's considered an imminent danger to the public, then the board can summarily suspend without a hearing, and then the person is entitled to a hearing within a brief period of time. And that is most of the summary suspensions that the board has done over the years, I believe, has been for people who are actively using alcohol or controlled substances and continuing to practice.
How would you know it? How would you be absolutely sure that's the case, rather than just hearsay?
Well, that has to be proven. And
but you said you can suspend without proof.
It's not no proof. There is a level that has to be shown. They have to show that there is probable cause to believe that the person has violated the rules, and probable cause to believe that there's an imminent danger to the public. But in addition to alcohol and drugs, there's also mental disabilities that people have that impair them from practice. And also there's a problem with some aging physicians with Alzheimer type diseases and such, where we had a few where we would summarily suspend and require a neuropsychological evaluation before they'd be allowed to practice again. And in several cases, once the evaluation was done, they just gave up their licenses.
How old were they?
Varied from probably late 60s, which I now consider a young man.
Yes.
And I think we had one in late 80s.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now you mentioned senility or something like when your memory is going. What about other mental issues?
I'm trying to remember a specific example, but certainly, I can remember many years ago a doctor who was actively untreated paranoid schizophrenic, and who the hospital where she was working did report her to us, and we were able to summarily suspend her. Fortunately, she went into treatment, was put on a medication that dealt with the issue, and then she was able to come back to practice.
Really? A schizophrenic could practice medicine?
Yep. Yes.
Wow. And behave in a way that would be comfortable for the patients?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you, from your background, do you think there's a certain age where a doctor should have to take some test to make sure he's still competent? Like we do with driver's licenses?
Yeah, I don't really think so. I think that most doctors, once they get to a certain age, are happy to retire and enjoy their lives without the tension and stress that's involved in practice. There are a few that over the years we had to drag out of practice, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
They wouldn't have stopped if we hadn't stopped them. But I think the number is so slight that it isn't worthwhile testing everyone.
Another story I have to bring this is I knew a gentleman who was 61 when he quit being a surgeon. He loved being a surgeon. And I knew him when he was in his mid-70s and still sharp and smart and all that, but he said he noticed he lost just a little edge. So he wouldn't have been disciplined by your board.
No, of course
not. But he knew he wasn't as good as he used to be.
And that's what most people do. Most people recognize it. That, I still play slow-pitch softball, but I recognize I don't have the skills I used to have, but I don't put anyone in danger by continuing to play. And most physicians, are practicing in settings where there's other people observing them and that they can consult with, for lack of a better term, that they can bounce things off of. And there's also a lot more peer review going on today than there was 30 years ago when I started prosecuting doctors.
Is it a little riskier to see a physician who's got a solo practice somewhere than see one who's got several partners? Or not?
I wouldn't say that it's riskier.
Can't they more likely go off the rails if they're all alone without anyone to observe them?
Yes. The short answer to that is yes. But there are an awful lot of good practitioners who choose to be solo practitioners. Although, these days there aren't a heck of a lot of them left out there. I haven't seen the numbers, but I remember when I first started this in 1980, there were a lot of sole practitioners, and there aren't anymore. And part of it's a financial thing.
Of course.
That you just can't support a practice that way.
Other things that get people in trouble. You haven't mentioned, you were with us earlier talking about psychotherapists, where sexual inappropriate behavior got psychotherapists in a lot of trouble. Does that ever happen with MDs?
Sure, it does. It happens with psychiatrists, and it happens with people in other specialties as well. And the board has a rule which specifically forbids sexual activity with a patient or with a former patient for 2 years.
Really?
Yeah.
So if you're seeing someone for a lesion on their forehead and you see them once and you remove that lesion and don't see him for another year, you cannot date that person?
That was the rule. What I have to look at for a moment, Dick, is that the Medical Examining Board, effective January 2013, totally revised their code of conduct, the offenses for which people could be disciplined. And it was the first time that a total revision had been done in 35 years. They had added things here and there in the past, but they totally revised it. And the section on what is allowed or prohibited in sexual activity, I just wanted to check to make sure that hadn't been changed. Yeah, it's still 2 years.
Still 2 years. So that's a pretty tough standard.
Yeah, it's 2 years, and if a pediatrician was seeing a child, it would be until the child was 20.
Well, sure. I take it this is a very small percentage of the incidents.
It is, but it has always been a larger percentage of the more serious disciplines that are imposed. You know, the most serious disciplines are revocations of licenses, suspensions of licenses, and surrenders of licenses. There are other disciplines which are more effective for certain conduct, but these are the ones that are considered the most serious. A surrender, they used to be called voluntary surrenders, but they weren't very voluntary. It was like we had their arm twisted behind them and saying, you either give it up or we're going to take it. And so the numbers of that last year, there were 2 licenses revoked, just taken away for misconduct. There were about 18 surrenders.
What's the difference between revocation and surrender?
Primarily language.
Okay, but you're done being a doctor.
The effect is the same. Now, revocation sounds final, but people can reapply, and after a period of years, if they could show that whatever the cause was for the revocation no longer existed, they might be able to get it back, but they have no right to get it back.
Those 20, what were they for?
A variety of things. Most, I think, were for a pattern of incompetent practice.
Is that mainly among older doctors?
Some of them were older doctors.
Not all?
Some of them weren't. Yeah,
wow.
Some of them weren't.
How can that happen? How can a middle-aged MD be that incompetent, below the minimum standard? How do they get by that long?
That's a good question. I can't answer.
Okay.
I can't answer. I mean, with some people, they just, for whatever reason, they start doing things that they don't know how to do well. One area over the past few years that had become a big issue was the prescribing of opioids for chronic pain. It was always accepted that you could prescribe appropriate doses of narcotics for acute pain. But there was always a concern about chronic pain, giving too large a doses, which would create addiction issues. At some point, it has become appropriate, or at least seen as appropriate, to prescribe these drugs for chronic pain, and not for, for example, people who have cancer with pain.
Right.
It's terminal anyway.
Yes. But it's an ongoing thing for an ongoing problem.
So it's now an ongoing thing for years and years.
Yeah.
And if you're going to do that, there really are practice standards that have to be met to do it. But we found there were several doctors who didn't have the expertise. They weren't pain doctors. They weren't anesthesiologists. Any specialty probably can do this, but they need additional training to do it right.
So why would you revoke their license rather than just say, you can't do this anymore? But
well, with some people, the resolution was to either suspend their license until they took additional training, or restrict their license so that they couldn't prescribe these sorts of drugs but could practice otherwise. But with some people, they just did it so
blatantly?
Often,
Yeah.
and so blatantly, and with such a disregard that you can't always prove what someone's intent is because they won't tell you. But looking at it, it was, oh, okay, this guy's using drugs as a moneymaker.
Sounds like the socially psychopath next door.
Well, I don't know.
I mean, that's so with such disregard for other people's welfare and for your own aggrandizement and money.
In some cases, it probably was.
What about that? What about financial fraud?
The medical board doesn't do many cases based on financial fraud unless there's already been a criminal conviction for it.
Okay. But what about people who oversubscribe or have people take tests they don't need, procedures they don't need? Who governs that?
Those are more difficult. I mean, they're not always black and white issues. Now, if Medicaid is involved or Medicare is involved in payments, then the Wisconsin Department of Justice or the U.S. Department of Justice will prosecute criminally.
Right.
And once there's a criminal conviction, the board can use that conviction as the basis for taking discipline against them. In some cases, those agencies choose not to bring criminal actions because they have to prove things beyond a reasonable doubt, whereas the medical board standard is only a preponderance of the evidence. More likely than not is preponderance of the evidence. And so there were times where both the medical board and the criminal investigation agencies were looking at the same doctors, and the criminal people would say, we just don't believe we can prove the case to our level. And the medical board, we would take the case and take an action against the person's license because we couldn't always prove that they were giving the drugs for the wrong intent, but we could prove that the drugs were being given outside what was normal practice.
Okay. And what about people that give too many tests and unnecessary tests because they want the revenue or the action or whatever?
I'm trying to think of a specific example where the medical board took any kind of action or where it was brought to their attention.
Okay.
And I can't think of one.
Okay, so it's not too common.
Not common for certain.
So if someone is disciplined for behavior resulting from drug abuse, do they often get better, or is that usually the end of their career?
Well, it depends. All right, there's more than one way to address this based on what the board felt was really going on with the person. There is a program called the Professional Assistance Procedure that if a physician self-reports him or herself, says, I have an issue with alcohol or drugs, they can, if they're approved for the program, they can go into the program, have no discipline taken against them, but the program is a way to assure everyone that they're practicing without using.
Sure.
The programming requires treatment. It requires abstinence from drugs and alcohol.
Are they drug tested?
Oh, yeah, they're drug tested. Every day they have to call in to see if it's their day to test. There's a random system. They call in every day, and if they don't show up on the day that they're told to show up, it's a violation. Now, do they immediately get disciplined if they relapse and use? No, they may, but that's a part of the disease process.
Yes.
And so oftentimes they will not be then referred for discipline, but instead it's noted. They get back on the program. They're back in treatment. They're going to 12-step groups if that's appropriate, and they're dropping urines every day.
So I take it if they don't self-report, but someone turns them in and you find it is true, then they're not treated with their license as
it can depend again. Again, if there's been no indication anyone's been harmed by their practice, if there are several criteria that might be used to analyze that, they may be allowed to go into that program anyway. But if they're not, if they believe, okay, they didn't report this, if it hadn't come to our attention, harm would have come to someone, then what will happen is their license is suspended, usually for 5 years, but the suspension is stayed or stopped so long as they're in this sort of a treatment program, almost the same as what is in the assistance procedure.
In closing, Jack, anything that you can suggest to patients to look out for, to do, to make sure that they are not on the wrong end of an incompetent?
Well, a couple things come to mind. One is you can go to the website for the Department of Safety and Professional Services.
Is this true everywhere in the country, or just in
this is true for Wisconsin, and it may be true for some other states.
Mm-hmm.
And in Wisconsin, you can go to that website. You can find out whether that doctor has ever been disciplined for anything.
Mm-hmm.
All right. That's one thing you can do. And of course, another thing you can do is, talk to your friends about what they know. And I guess most of all, if you go into a doctor and he or she says or does something you're uncomfortable with, for whatever reason you're uncomfortable, you may want to look at that a little more and consider whether you want to go somewhere else.
Well, Jack Zweig, I thank you very much for filling us in on this, and I hope you'll join us on the next edition of Insights. Doctors are very important figures in our lives that sometimes even have our lives in their hands. However, being only human, a few in their Doctors are very important figures in our lives that sometimes even have our lives in their hands. However, being only human, a few in their ranks may act irresponsibly or recklessly, and some may be simply incompetent. That's when licensing boards often get involved. Welcome to Insights. I'm Dick Goldberg. Today we'll examine what types of... Oh, shoot.